It is a common fallacy to believe that communication is just speech, when it's so much more than that. It is the eye contact we avoid or purposely make, the touches we give, the words we don't say, the pauses in thought, the way our body leans forward eagerly in conversations, or away in disdain. Sometimes it's written, other times shown, most often said, but rarely is it entirely understood. A sign of affection is so captivating, as it teaches us the extent of what it truly means to communicate, and it also reflects our own inherent biases. Because I am a non-disabled hearing person, I wanted to provide some resources and terminology for the deaf and hard of hearing community that we will be going by for this video. According to the National Association of the Deaf, the NAD, commonly associated terms for people who are deaf, hard of hearing, deaf disabled, deaf blind, and late deafened. The ways in which deaf or hard of hearing people communicate is also different and can vary. In the example of a sign of affection, we see Yuki use sign language predominantly, but not every person who is deaf or hard of hearing knows sign language. Additionally, some people who are deaf or hard of hearing don't also identify as disabled. I will address deaf, hard of hearing, and disabled. I want to make sure I give a little bit of distinction with that. I also want to say that these guidelines are very general. If you know a deaf, hard of hearing, or disabled person in your life, make sure to find out the ways in which they communicate, find out the ways in which they want to be referred to, treat everyone as an individual, and be respectful. Part of my purpose for this video is to bring up thoughts and questions about the representation in the series, and also discuss the communication of the series and how important it is to the story. If I do miss any important aspects, especially when it comes to talking about deaf, hard of hearing, or disabled communities, please don't feel afraid to bring that up in the comments down below. Yubisaki to Renren literally translates to fingertips and affection, but commonly known in English as a sign of affection. It's a shoujo manga created by the duo Sue Morishita, who created other works such as Like a Butterfly and Shortcake Cake. A Sign of Affection is a slice-of-life romance story between a deaf college girl named Yuki, who communicates primarily through sign language, and Itsuomi, a college boy who travels the world and collects languages. And it explores how these two communicate through the barriers of using different languages, and along the way widening one another's perspectives on the world and themselves. In an interview with Kodansha, Sue Morishita disclosed why they wanted to make a shoujo manga with a deaf protagonist, with them saying, quote, "We felt that there were a lot of important elements that crossed over between both sign language and the shoujo manga genre. Both are full of expressions and emotions that aren't entirely stated and exist beyond just the dialogue." End quote. For any avid shoujo reader, you may be familiar with what they're talking about. A shoujo manga often utilizes a vast amount of negative space and ephemeral imagery, shimmering images or special effects, and abstract backgrounds to depict intense emotions with their characters without using words or dialogue. Sue Morishita also talked about their desire to accurately and respectfully depict Yuki's story and her world, stating in the same interview with Kodansha how they also interviewed instructors who worked at schools for the deaf and worked closely with Yuki Miyazaki, a deaf person who shares her experiences with them and who supervises A Sign of Affection sign language. From what can be gathered from this interview and what Sue Morishita expressed in the pages of their manga, it seems that they set off to create a wholesome romance story that focuses on communication and providing accurate representation for a deaf protagonist that may not be often seen in manga. From the moment we meet Yuki, we learn how important communication is to her. During Yuki and Itsuomi's first interaction, Yuki takes her time showing Itsuomi how she communicates. Using body language, she reveals her hearing aid. Using sign language, she slowly but smoothly communicates her gratitude. And Itsuomi understands right away. We later learn that Itsuomi is a person who loves to travel and has been to many countries in the world. And because of this context, we understand why he quickly is able to kind of understand what Yuki is trying to convey to him. And he recognizes her desire to communicate to him because it is something that he sees within himself whenever he travels to other countries. Yubisaki to Renren expands the definition of what it means to communicate and listen. Because understanding someone through their expressions, through their actions, their words, no matter how they are expressed, and the spaces in between them still allows you to accept them. Itsuomi and Yuki's relationship is portrayed to be patient, full of physical, written, and signed communication, but also full of mistakes and mishaps. Yuki sometimes misreads Itsuomi's lips, which is more clearly shown in the manga than the anime, And Itsuomi crosses Yuki's boundaries before she has a chance to convey them. But it's the open and honest desire of both of the characters to express how they feel to one another that allows them to address and also fix some of the mistakes that are made along the way. The more that you communicate, the better they are at understanding what the other is trying to say, especially as Itsuomi learns more sign language, which is one of Yuki's primary ways of communicating. And the series wastes no time showing us that their relationship is flawed but growing. And in contrast to the way we view them as a couple, we see how other characters view Yuki and the flawed but honest and kind of realistic ways that a sign of affection reflects real life. And this is most seen, I believe, through Oshi's character. Oushi is Yuki's childhood friend and also the rival love interest of the story. At first, he comes off as rude and kind of distant, but also some may argue that he has good intentions, even when these intentions end up reflecting harmful and sometimes hurtful stereotypes about the deaf and hard of hearing communities. After helping a deaf person on the subway, Oushi expresses that the world is too dangerous for them and they should stay in the safety of their bubbles. He also seems to give himself a hero complex because he puts it on himself to look out for Yuki and watch over her well-being, which in other series is often seen as cute, right? Like a protagonist or a male lead or a love interest being protective of their partner and wanting them to be safe is a nice thing to have. However, in this case, it comes with the context of Yuki being deaf and how Oushi may view her as incapable of making her own decisions because of her deafness. Some even argue that Oushi is being ableist or autist for the ways in which he interacts with Yuki and the way he thinks about Yuki and other deaf and hard of hearing people.
Oushi in A Sign of Affection is literally a walking red flag. He tells her that Itsuomi probably is just playing with her and messing with her. It's like he's implying that she is not worth having a man actually see her.
So we're on the same page. I'm going to define what autism and ableism are. Autism is defined as the notion that one is superior based on one's ability to hear or behave in the manner of one who hears. And ableism is defined as a set of beliefs or practices that devalue and discriminate against people with physical, intellectual, or psychiatric disabilities and often rests on the assumption that disabled people need to be fixed in one form or the other. Both of these are unfortunately common forms of thought that able-bodied hearing people often have or are something that's kind of ingrained in our society because society is built mostly for able-bodied and hearing. For fans that root for Oushi, this mindset might connect with them. They too may have well-intentioned notions about how deaf or hard of hearing people should exist in society. Might sound like a tangent, but it'll come back to A Sign of Affection in a second. I started reading another series titled I Hear the Sunspot, which is a similar series in that it's a slice of life romance set in college. One of the main characters is a person who is hard of hearing. His name is Kohei, and his romantic interest is named Taichi, and he's a note-taker for Kohei. One day talks to a friend about Kohei, and she expresses to him how she wants to meet Kohei because she wants to be like this character in a book where the girl takes care of a guy who is deaf and learns sign language. And she romanticizes the idea of wanting to take care of this person. And Taichi immediately becomes concerned and a bit upset because, first of all, Kohei is hard of hearing, he's not deaf. Also, second of all, he doesn't use sign language to communicate. And thirdly, he's upset because by being around Kohei, he's come to understand that his world is just like who he is. It's his life. It's not something that should just be pitied and used as a way to make someone else feel better. And I kind of feel like this reflects in Oushi and in the fans of A Sign of Affection. This can be used as an example of trying to use A Sign of Affection in real life to appeal to people who are deaf or hard of hearing, kind of come off heroically, kind of similar to how Oshi's character wants to be seen in the story. But it is often the well-meaning ableism, autism that hurts the most to see. I found several creators on TikTok who would kind of express the frustrations of people coming up to them with ideas and notions similar to Oshi's in A Sign of Affection and how frustrating it is.
You guys were confused why I use sign language if I can speak. So I speak for you to understand me. It's not the other way around. And yes, I do have hearing aids and I lip read to understand you, but there's a limit to what I can hear and not hear. For example, I'm 100% deaf in my right ear and hard of hearing in my left ear. With hearing aids and lip reading, I still have to be face to face with someone to understand what the person is saying.
As for A Sign of Affection as a series, I reached out to some of my audience to have them talk about some of the things they thought about Oushi as a character and the story as a whole. One user who identified as being disabled but not hard of hearing says,
A Sign of Affection, in my opinion, represents living with a disability really well. I feel very seen with regards to Yuki's own internalized ableism. Oushi, who's the worst, is also a well-written character who is a representation of ableism in society, unintentional or otherwise.
Another writes in regards to Oushi,
I am also very frustrated with people disregarding Oshi's ableism. I feel like the anime is trying to make that part of him clearer, yet somehow people aren't getting it. People often use being overprotective as a way to brush off ableism, and a lot of the audience is doing that. He literally says they, deaf people, should stay where they're safe and not leave. That's crazy! Imagine someone said, women should just stay where they're safe and not leave because it's more dangerous for them. It's silly and degrading. Disabled people know the dangers and accommodations we may need. You can help accommodate for us, but give us some respect.
I also have unintentionally been ableist. When I worked in a school district with disabled children, I took on terms that the school district used that I've heard throughout my entire life to refer to them, when I now know that those terms are outdated, wrong, and can be harmful to hear. So knowing what I know now, I try to go forward and do better when addressing people and addressing that bias within myself. And it's why I appreciate characters like Oushi, even though it's valid to dislike him. But I think he's still a really important character because we see him as a reflection of our own inherent biases towards deaf, hard of hearing, possibly disabled people. And it is easier to see through a character like him how doing that is wrong than it is to kind of find that within our own selves, because we're so used to living off of the notions that we have been taught throughout our entire lives. I have a clear bias towards Itsuomi. I just want to make y'all aware of that, but let me break down Itsuomi versus Oushi and their main differences. Itsuomi is kind of Oshi's opposite, where Oushi is more reserved and keeps to himself and kind of has a harder time addressing his emotions and his feelings. Itsuomi is pretty upfront about everything up in his life, about everything he's feeling. Part of this can be attributed to Itsuomi growing up overseas in Germany and taking on characteristics that may not seem typical of Japanese culture. And this is being pointed out from the series itself with a scene with Oushi and Itsuomi. In the manga, he states that Japanese people don't really like people who bleach their hair and have tattoos. It makes them uncomfortable. And I think that's a reflection of the notion that Itsuomi, being privy to other cultures different from Japan, has made him a more upfront person. Itsuomi's openness and Yuki's desire to communicate complement each other and help to ease them through the barriers of communication, which is a common point of contention in a lot of romance series. And he also is just a guy with a dream of traveling and meeting new people. Cy Catwell, in an article reviewing the first manga of A Sign of Affection, explores a valuable point about Itsuomi and Yuki's relationship, stating, quote, rather than just constantly texting Yuki, Itsuomi has to become a more flexible person. For him, that means regularly meeting Yuki where she and her needs are, and I find this much more valuable than Yuki changing to meet the demands of an inherently ableist world, unquote. Catwell also further discusses how refreshing it is to see a non-disabled person accommodate to the needs of their disabled partner instead of having Yuki accommodate or change the way she communicates just to speak to him. We could argue the hypotheticals all day, but the takeaway is that Itsuomi is pretty great. And I think all of these attributes of Itsuomi and his relationship with Yuki are important takeaways. A reminder that you and your partner should be constantly listening and trying to understand one another and trying to meet one another where you are. And then there's Yuki. The manga and anime doesn't really shy away from making Yuki the focal point of the story, and because of this, Yuki feels like a person that we're meant to connect with. For Yuki, her ambitions and desire for autonomy are clear in how she actively pursues Itsuomi, and how she is honest and straightforward and dedicated to reach her goal of traveling with him. Yes, many of her goals are centered around Itsuomi, but I believe that her desire to expand her world, something that we kind of learned about in the earlier part of the story, is representative in the fact that she's decided to go to a co-ed college instead of continuing her education in a deaf school. And this is something Itsuomi points out in the story in this scene.
それはユキが大学っていう選択肢を選んでくれたからで。ああ。
And this brings up the point that even though Itsuomi seems to influence a lot of Yuki's decisions, she inherently has always wanted the things that she is now seeking. And it's because of Itsuomi that she is pushing herself more to achieve what she's always wanted to do. Yuki is also sweet and girly. And this is nothing new for shoujo, romance leads. I mean, I made a whole video about the cute girls in anime and the contention with them in another video. But at times, it seems her cute nature distracts or discredits her autonomy, adding to the idea of infantilization of disabled people that is a constant stigma. The concept of infantilization denotes the treating of someone with an approach of a child, sometimes with an air of overenthusiasm or lightening of one's voice, or in the case of a deaf individual, sometimes talking to their interpreter rather than to them and ignoring their existence entirely. And it can be emotionally taxing on deaf and disabled individuals to constantly get this treatment from the people in their lives. Winter Rice, who identifies as autistic, says in an article titled "Putting an End to the Infantilization of Disabled People," disability will often be automatically and subconsciously associated with helplessness. The infantilization of the disabled is a constant and persistent problem that severely impairs our ability to advocate for our rights. And we often see this in the way that Oushi treats Yuki, as I brought up earlier, reprimanding Yuki for being out too late past her curfew as if he is her parent and he gets to decide what she is able to do. And oftentimes Yuki responds with annoyance and impatience. But I also need to add that Itsuomi even acts like this as well, often saying how Yuki is cute and talking about how innocent and adorable that she is, which, as some point out, is kind of a common thing in Japanese media to see, especially in anime, like the cuteness of a main character, and the fact that Itsuomi pats Yuki on the head often. However, in the case of sign of affection, and I believe even in Japanese Sign Language, JSL, patting someone on the head is a sign of affection and not seen as demeaning as it may be in Western cultures like in the US. Itsuomi also constantly says that Yuki is similar to like a bunch of little cute animals that he names randomly. And there's a part in the manga where Yuki addresses this, but I don't want to get into spoilers. So again, some people who responded to my inquiry to see how like a sign of affection reflected real experiences and their thoughts on the story had this to say about Yuki's infantilization in the series. One anonymous user wrote, "My only issue is that the female lead is, in my opinion, infantilized by Itsuomi and Oushi. Oushi was overbearing at times and acted like Yuki needed to rely on him because he can sign. Itsuomi, on the other hand, talks about how cute, innocent, and pure Yuki is. This may be a cultural thing though, because Japan has a much stronger focus on cuteness being a desirable trait. Also, both guys have prevented her to communicate at some point by blocking her view or preventing her from signing." And another wrote, "I dislike how Yuki is portrayed as innocent and very childlike because of her deafness. In general, comparing a small world to deafness and a big world to hearing is annoying to me as it erases how big deaf culture is, and actually how most deaf people prefer to hang around deaf circles rather than hearing communities. It's frustrating." Sigil, who identifies as someone with a disability, writes, "I feel somewhat iffy about the male lead's relationship to her disability. In a romance, we should know strongly about why each person loves the other, but I feel like his love of her innocence and purity feels a little creepy in the context of her being disabled and somewhat isolated compared to him, especially because he makes everything about learning sign language." And these are notable transgressions. The ways in which her friends interact with her are imperfect, but there are efforts from them to treat her with respect. And if Yuki doesn't like something, she often addresses it, and people in her life are quick to make changes if she tells them something. As for Yuki being cute and infantilization, and it is the status quo for women in anime to be either cute or very maturely sexualized, and there's like no in between. And to clarify, I'm not talking about people who say Yuki and Itsuomi's relationship is cute or say that the show is like wholesome and adorable. I'm talking specifically about how people view Yuki in terms of like all she is her deafness. Yuki may be a fictional character, but her experiences reflect real life. So by perceiving her as only her disability and discrediting her autonomy, summing up her existence as just cute or adorable, and viewing her in the same vein as a child despite the fact that she's in college and is about to come of age, it's likely that fans might view real people similarly, which leads to negative impacts on real people who are emotionally affected by these continued negative interactions. The anime has just introduced everyone to the story and Yuki's character. There are so many discussions in the manga that reveal who Yuki is, what she does and does not tolerate, as well as the many decisions that she comes to make later on. Her existence is still a simple but important form of representation that introduces people to her world. And just like any representation in media, Yuki's story alone won't cover every aspect, every facet of the experience of being deaf or hard of hearing, and how diverse that can be. But it can open doors for other creators to want to create stories that reflect these types of people and their experiences. I reached out to fellow A Sign of Affection fans to see what they thought of the show and the representation of Yuki as a character, of how she's treated by other characters, and so on. And this is what you all had to say. Harvest Moon Eve wrote,
I am not hard of hearing, but I identify with the isolation experience as someone with a disability. Many people don't know how to talk to you, and it's like you're in a separate world. There's so much you have to teach people about how you function, and there's so much more you have to do just to connect with people. However, it's also so lovely when you meet someone who's willing to see you for who you are.
Micah writes, I think it's an overall good depiction of disability, the small ways it can affect your daily life, the need for accommodations, and misunderstandings when people can't tell you're disabled. I also think the show does a wonderful job of show, don't tell when it comes to disability, and that it doesn't take itself out of the story to explain some facet of disability or deaf culture, instead naturally integrating that into the scenes and discussions. One anonymous user who identified as a university teacher who taught deaf students wrote, some things the show hasn't addressed, a variety of perspectives of deaf culture. Some students view it as a disability, others view it as a different language, and would be upset if called disabled. Some students are fully deaf, some can partially hear or use hearing aids, some have cochlear implants and can hear when their devices turn on, some can lip read, some can't. Zenon, who identifies as being able-bodied but in a relationship with a disabled person, says, A Sign of Affection shows the cuteness, shyness, and vulnerability of the beginning of being in such a relationship, and it's very refreshing. When you get into their world, you can see a cuteness that no one else does. We love watching this together and rooting for Itsuomi and Yuki. Sun, who identifies as a woman with cerebral palsy, wrote,
I think seeing it through the lens of a series like A Sign of Affection being about a disabled/deaf woman is essential. So often we are considered pests, unlovable, burdens, but in this, Yuki is unconditionally loved. No need to be cured, no surpassing disability. She is allowed to be loved in a cheesy shoujo manner, to have fluff, which for a lot of abled audiences might be redundant. But for disabled people, it's anything but taken for granted.
I also wanted to highlight some reactions to A Sign of Affection from some deaf, hard of hearing, disabled people who related to Yuki and her story.
This right here is me. I can't tell which sounds are coming from where or what they are. I'm extremely hard of hearing. I only hear out of my right ear, and this is something that I deal with a lot.
I do want to address how disabilities and deafness and being hard of hearing is thought of in Japan through several articles and things that I learned about. I'm going to put a content warning for violent crime. I'll try to make this a timestamp so you can skip ahead if you don't want to hear about this portion. But I learned from a user who submitted a response. Their name is Sun. They pointed out a case of a man in Japan who took the lives of 19 disabled individuals back in 2016. Something about this case actually sparked a whole discussion about how Japan views disabilities, because many of the names of the victims were not released to the public, and some speculate this is due to shame of having a family member or a relative who was disabled. On top of that, of course, there's also the discussion of this person who held really harmful ideals about disabled people, so much so that he took 19 people's lives. And though A Sign of Affection shifts away from talking about really traumatic experiences when it comes to Yuki and her being deaf, it does touch on a little bit in the story the real experiences of people who are deaf and having to go to a private kind of hidden school where they're not interacting with hearing people. and family members often keep their disabled children away from attention. A mother of a nonverbal child who uses sign language to communicate says, "Although I'm delighted by the inclusion of signing in an anime, I was taken aback by the notion that Yuki's mother would not have learned to sign. It seems improbable to me that a parent of a child that is deaf from birth wouldn't learn to sign." Like Yuki's parents not learning sign language, part of that can also be attributed to the idea of shame of people in relatives that may have disabilities. Also, I learned that family members don't usually learn sign language for people who are deaf or disabled or are hard of hearing. Here are some statistics of the amount of disabled people in Japan and how they feel about being represented as well as respected in their society. I'm also extremely happy that Yuki got just this fluffy romance where she's the main character and gets to live fluffy romance life. It's great. The only other mostly wholesome anime that has a deaf lead that I've seen is Ranking of Kings, which is a really good fantasy anime about a young boy who is deaf and he's the heir to a kingdom, but because he is deaf, he is not seen as a viable heir to the current king. He has to go basically fight in this tournament to become the next king. Not slice of life at all, fantasy, action, adventure more, but it still has a really positive message about it. And for manga, I've currently read and can recommend at least the first volumes of I Hear the Sunspot, which I mentioned earlier. And another one I recently read and found out about is called The Moon on a Rainy Night, and that is a girls' love romance slice of life series set in high school. Both of them have hard of hearing protagonists. And I like them also because they show an alternative perspective to people who are hard of hearing and may not be completely deaf, and also people who have lost their hearing later on in life. As for a silent voice, a lot of people like to say sign of affection is similar to a silent voice, but I actually don't recommend, if you like a sign of affection, to watch a silent voice, because I think they're two totally different series. Really, the only things they have in common is that they have two female leads who are deaf and use sign language. But other than that, a sign of affection is a slice of life romance. Silent voice is like a traumatic drama more about a character trying to redeem himself from terrible things that he did in his past, rather than a focus on the girl who is actually deaf in the story. So depicting healthy communication in the series is something that I enjoy talking about. I've made a whole other video about communication and how it's used in slice of life and romance. I love that a sign of affection, that is its main focus. It's centered on communication and how much communication encompasses so many other aspects than just verbally talking, speaking, and listening. There's a quote from Sue Morishita's interview with Kodansha that really sticks with me. They say, "Although sign language is a visual way to communicate, we hope that the emotions and sentiments that show up between gaps in the fingers can be conveyed to the readers as well, and that they take notice of what is left unsaid." I think it's really important to view the story as a whole in this way as well, paying attention to the aspects that the story intentionally leaves out, sometimes the trauma and negativity that we often see in other stories about the same subject, and instead focus on the other messages that the story is trying to convey about communication and relationships. Even the comparison between Yuki and the way she communicates with the people in her life versus other characters in the series who aren't deaf or hard of hearing, and how they still blunder through their communication with one another. I think that also is an aspect that really gets looked at for the series. I may not have been able to add everyone's responses to the survey I put out, but I still want to thank everyone for providing their reviews. Thank you for participating. I may continue to do this in the future with other stories where I want to hear from more people about how they are perceiving a show or a series or a manga that I'm talking about. I also want to say that I will be listing all of the creators and peoples that I mentioned in a sources list, in a Google Doc down in the description for you to go look through. Please go support them. But as always, let me know what you think about a sign of affection. Let me know what you think about the possible representation in the story, about the relationships, and more. What other shoujo series do you think deserve adaptations like this? The anime for this is beautiful, the art's incredible, and so many people have loved the series because of the anime, and I'm deeply appreciative of that, and I hope we get more series, more shoujo series too like this. Thank you so much for watching. Remember that communication expands beyond just words, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.